This being kickoff Sunday, I thought a few football quips would be appropriate. A couple quotes here. Uh, the legendary quarterback Joe Namath said one time, "When you win, nothing hurts." Alex Karras, who was I believe, a defensive tackle in his career and played for the University of Iowa, he said, I never graduated from Iowa, but I was only there for 2 terms, Truman's and Eisenhower's. Duffy Daugherty, who was the former coach of Michigan State, said, "I could have been a Rhodes Scholar except for my grades." And when Murray Warmoth, longtime head coach of University of Minnesota, said, "If lessons are learned in defeat, our team is getting a great education." And then finally, Knute Rockne, Notre Dame, "I've found that prayers work best when you have big players." When it comes to nature, probably my greatest weakness or my greatest admiration are rivers. Any river or any creek that flows anywhere, I could contemplate for hours. The Kansas River, right here in our own backyard, crossing the Missouri River in Kansas City, Mississippi as it winds its way through the Twin Cities or along the banks of St. Louis, or the Colorado River as it carves its way through giant canyons, the Snake River as it meanders through Wyoming and Colorado, or the Youghiogheny River carrying countless rafters between its shores in southwestern Pennsylvania. There is a mystery and an intrigue to rivers, so much that one of the more popular movies I've mentioned before several times in the 90s, and we saw a film clip from it, centered around a river based on the book by Norman Maclean, A River Runs Through It, directed by Robert Redford and filmed mostly on the Gallatin River in southwestern Montana. Rivers, and especially this movie, bring out a host of emotions: excitement, adventure, reflection, the beauties and tragedies of life, and the simplicity and the complexity of families. And we are well aware, too, that rivers can create havoc and floods, but they also recede and are beautiful as they wind their way through rugged canyons and beautiful valleys and rolling hills, industrial towns, rural communities, ranches, and farms. And so it is with life. It has its beauty and its heartbreaks. And often we know these heartbreaks recede a little bit, but it's always a challenge of getting through them when they are upon us. Some of you were here when we had a big flood in Manhattan in 1851, when this church had at least 3 feet of water downstairs in Fisher Hall. The challenge was huge for the congregation. It was also huge for the city to overcome the disaster of that year, but the waters receded and the rebuilding began. The life of a river is a combination of opposite features, as life can be a combination of opposite features. As St. Augustine said, "Where there is humility, there is majesty. Where there is weakness, there is might. Where there is death, there is life." Rivers have a way of falling and rising, as does life have a way of falling and rising. Rivers have their floods, as does life have its floods. Rivers have their calm, as life has its calm. Rivers can drop off in the form of waterfalls. Life can drop off in the form of unexpected and unfortunate events and circumstances. Norman Maclean writes in his book, A River Runs Through It, his description of the Big Blackfoot River in Montana, a river his family called their family river. He writes, "It runs seemingly straight for a while, turns abruptly, then runs smoothly again, then meets another obstacle, again turns sharply, and again runs smoothly." This can also describe life, can it? With its peace, its surprises, its sudden turns, its joys, its heartbreaks. The prophet Jeremiah and his fellow Jewish refugees in about 600 BC must have felt the twists and turns of the realities of the world when they found themselves in exile after the destruction of their beloved Jerusalem. The people were caught in the middle of a power struggle between Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt. And now Jeremiah and others face their biggest heartbreak of life, forced to leave their homeland. So they did a natural thing, and they gathered by the peacefulness of a river to reflect on their roots and their memories. On different occasions, they would gather by what was perhaps the Tigris River, or one of its tributaries, or the Euphrates River, forming what is known, of course, as the Fertile Crescent. And there they lamented, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion, or Jerusalem, how can we sing the song of the Lord in a strange land? Later, Israel would rise again, but not in Jeremiah's and his contemporaries' lifetime. And so when we go back to the analogy of the river, what is common about every river is that it has a beginning and an end. It has a source and it has a mouth. And in spite of what happens along its route, it still has a clear destination. You know, if these rivers could only talk, the stories they could tell, the towns they saw, the barges and the boats, the fishermen, the children playing on their banks, the canoes and the rafts, the smokestacks and the restaurants, the farms and the ranches, the heartbreaks of their floods, the stories of remarkable recoveries. But just as a river carves its way through a clear and certain path toward a clear and certain destination, you and I know that rarely life ends up that way, the way we think it's going to end up. There are invariably surprises, joys, triumphs, crises, disappointments, heartbreaks along life's course. The prophet Jeremiah was a young man from a privileged background. So the thought of being in exile ever, I imagine, never came close to registering on his radar. The same can be said for many of us. Many of the things that you and I end up doing, many of the things that happen to us, many of the joys and many of these sorrows, we could have never predicted years ago. But we know the Mississippi is going to flow through St. Louis today. And we know it will do the same 50 years from now. We know that Kansas is flowing through Manhattan as we worship today. And it will do the same 50 years from now. But not necessarily so for our own lives. We're never exactly sure where we are going to end up 40, 30, 20, 10, 5 years from now, even 1 year from now. Careers can take unexpected turns. Health can deteriorate. One's financial picture may change. An unexpected problem develops in the family. A crisis happens within an institution affecting thousands of people. A natural disaster dramatically alters a family's life. Those are the negatives, but there are many positives that change the course of our lives too, in the form of careers and family and relationships and matters of faith. Positives that we could not have predicted either, but much to our delight, come to light. But one thing can be said with 100% certainty. No matter what happens in life, God is on yours and my side. However our courses change, good or bad, God is with us the entire way. And belief and faith in this gives you and me a clear destination, that no matter where you and I end up, you and I have a sense, a companionship of the love of God. And that is what God has intended yours and my destination to be all along. A peace with Him and an understanding of your connection to Him. Norman MacLean wrote, "All things merge into one, and a river runs through it." a young woman from our congregation several years ago named Cameron went off to Atlanta to work in an inner city daycare. And she told me that this experience opened up her life and her spirit. Even a year before she left for the mission, she never dreamed in 1,000 years she'd be doing it. She said that she had found peace in knowing that God was with her no matter where her life took her. That if she did not trust God with her relationships or with her life, she would be left feeling empty. And so how true it is that you and I need faith and assurance that we aren't going it alone, that there is an ultimate destination. In the book of Teen Revivals, that I mentioned several years ago, by Doris Kearns Goodwin, an illuminating look at the genius of Abraham Lincoln, she writes about the tragic death of Lincoln's second son, 3-year-old son, Eddie, to pulmonary tuberculosis. After the boy's passing, Mary Todd Lincoln's grief was inconsolable, to the point where she couldn't stop crying, and she finally stopped eating. And finally, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Illinois, who conducted the services for her son, was able to console her. As the author said, Mary Todd Lincoln